Last week we did, we started on Sunday, I think it was, Sunday morning, and finished, I think, Thursday morning. We did an aerial application to the marsh, and then we followed up with, 3 days of backpack on ground treatments. We total acreage, I want to say, was, I think, 241 acres. That's retreating some of the areas twice. But we kind of had it was an interesting tide. It was a very long tide, so it looked like when we got back out there, we had to retreat some areas that we had treated not 2 days before. So we did a lot of treating last week. The trap counts, I think, are continuing to go down, or right now they're hovering. I think at decent numbers, so we're not seeing a whole lot of adult mosquitoes still. And we're going to begin treating again tomorrow. So we were out there, starting yesterday and all day today. And the tides this week are putting a little water on the marsh, not quite as much, but I suspect we'll do 60 acres or so, more or less. We'll do it by the end of the week.
Yeah, I think actually the first flight I saw was Saturday of last week.
Yeah. Could be. I lose track of the days, to be honest with you.
Well, I was able to notice it when it came within about 50 feet of my house. It's hard to miss.
Yeah.
Over the trees and down into the marsh.
Yeah, I think the biggest issue with the application was we were told not to fly the plane directly over town for fear that it was too low, so he flew down the beach and up, and then I guess he was flying too close to the rocks and the birds on the rocks, so we got calls about that. So otherwise, I don't know of any complaints about it.
No, he flew east to west across the marsh.
Yeah.
And then came up over the bridge. I said, what do you need, Tom?
Very negligible. We actually are at the point of looking once a week and not finding much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Roger, can I ask Dan a question?
Yeah, sure.
Dan, it's raining. How much workload is that going to add watering up places that the tide may or may not water up if the rain will?
Yeah, that's what we were trying to get a handle on today. I'll know tomorrow, is what I can tell you. I don't think a whole lot more, because it's not a super heavy rain. It's just kind of a nice steady rain, but I think it's definitely putting more water on the marsh than the tide alone would have. So that's why I actually expected when I came here this week we would do very little treatment because the tide's relatively small. But with the rainwater, I think we're going to do quite a bit more than I was thinking.
So you had everybody out sampling today?
Yeah. There's 5 of us on the marsh all day.
I can tell you from just being right by there, it hasn't been a lot of heavy rain out there. It's just been kind of steady drizzle most of the night.
Nice steady.
Did you have, so Dan gave us an update on the spraying. Do you have anything else to report or what's going on out there from the Coos County Public Health perspective?
So, last week's tracking indicated that not much dorsalis out there. Of course, Dan told you that could change next week. I hope it's minimal. And guys are spending a lot of time out there. And when, whatever reason, the application was not effective, maybe it doesn't matter, but those guys were out there looking and measuring, and hey, this didn't work. And so anyway, a lot of energy being spent trying to stay on top of it.
Okay.
And I'm not really big into visual graphic type stuff, but I'm giving you all different data here from different sites, and just showing week by week or sample event by sample event So the blue line shows all the mosquitoes that were in the trap.
Tell us what you got.
I sent it to Joyce, but I don't know if you got it.
If this is a sparrow.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you sent it to the county?
Yes.
Yeah, you're on, Dan.
Okay. I don't know what to say, it's self-explanatory. Maybe for the audience, so all I did was just take a real quick run at looking into setting up the mosquito traps in the lower Coquille Valley, roughly from Bandon to just past the city of Coquille, to establish a baseline for mosquito abundance. And it's not to get absolute numbers on how many mosquitoes are out there, it's just to look at relative abundance. Actually, one of the questions I had, Rick, too, about these traps and the numbers in this graph, how long were these traps deployed to get those kind of numbers, like 160 mosquitoes, just overnight? Yeah.
Late afternoon to early morning.
And so, you know, that's the point of this. So you could just, maybe one day a week from 1st of May to the 1st of October, with 20 volunteers and a suite of not these mosquito magnets, but the traps that use the dry ice. You can probably generate some pretty good numbers in terms of a baseline for mosquito abundance in the valley. Then a question everybody raised was, well, what good is that going to do us? And I tried to address that with some borderline controversial statements at the end of my piece right here. But, you know, I am of the opinion, after going through this for almost 30 years now, that we really need to back up and take another look at the converting of farmlands, productive farmlands into marshes. I'm not talking about wetlands, I'm talking about marshes. These aren't wetlands, really, they're marshes that they're making. And you're not going to be able to do anything about it. If, for example, in this instance with the Fish and Wildlife Service plot, what if the damage or the numbers of mosquitoes had only been about half the level that was generated by the marsh? Would we even have a vector committee? Because people could just argue, well, it was a seasonal thing, it happened this year, or whatever, because you wouldn't have any numbers to actually object or raise an objection. So that's all we're after here. And it's going to have to be pretty major shifts in the numbers of mosquitoes for a survey like I've described here to work, to provide you the data that you would need. For a landowner, and I put this in this one-page thing, really, and I live above a pasture. My pasture is only about 15 acres. I'm about 80 feet up from it. I've got swallow boxes and bat boxes. I can sit on my deck at this hour of the night and not have to worry about anything biting me. But we've got mosquitoes in my pasture, but they're at a very low level. What I'm saying is, I know this may sound selfish, but really, if you're a true Darwinian, everything should be done in your self-interest first. And that is this. I don't want my lifestyle altered because somebody's trying to save something. Save the planet. I'm sorry, that's the way I look at it. It's not, it may seem really selfish and it's just a small price to pay for you to put DEET on if you want to go outside the evenings. No. No. That's the way I feel about it. Now, we may be able to do a lot of restoration of wetlands into marshes in this county without causing a problem, because it may be in areas where there's nobody living. Pretty isolated, like the examples of South Slough, for example. There's nobody out there. They can do all the wetland restoration they want, and there aren't going to be any major problems. But now they're not doing that anymore. We're talking about converting up to thousands of more acres in Coos County.
Yeah, and they are considering reestablishing their expansion. They're talking about
Anyway, I would like to be able to establish some sort of baseline data, so at least landowners, if not the county itself, would have some basis in which they could argue, you either clean up that problem, or you will in fact have to reclaim it back into pasture. Enough. And that also goes for their effect on neighboring landowners' pastures.
Yeah.
That's the problem. That is a major problem I have. And the reason I have that problem is because I've been working on this sort of stuff for 30 years in this county. I was one of the original people that when I was the head of the Pacific Estuarine Research Society, that used to go back to DC every quarter and argue for money to establish the National Estuarine Research Complex, the South Sloop. So I'm all behind that sort of work, but that was supposed to be a research facility, not a sanctuary. And that's what we're looking at now. People want to start creating sanctuaries. It's way beyond, and remember this, I'll get on my little soapbox here, but here's the other thing to remember. When the wetland stuff started with the Clean Water Act, it was based on the statement, if you remember this, no net loss of wetlands. Remember that? Well, we're way beyond no net loss in Oregon. You've gained tens of thousands of acres of marshlands in this state. In my opinion, I don't think anybody should have to mitigate for any loss of marshland anymore. You got mitigation banks essentially all over the county. Which brings up the final point of that thing I put in here, because it may seem a little puzzling. But in having to deal with it on the Soil and Water Board, when I was a member there for 8 years, and then as a pasture owner myself, one of the things that's happened over 30 years of regulations being promulgated by the state, backed up by environmental groups, is for us landowners that are farmers and ranchers going through these ridiculous permit processes to keep ditches and creeks clear. As far as I'm concerned, the only bodies of water in Coos County you should have to get some kind of permit to dredge are navigable by the old original definition, river. That would be the lower Coquille, the Coos, and the Mellicone. Other than that, if you've got a creek running through your pasture, all you should have to do is give the state notice you're going to dredge within the temporal window that they've outlined. And that's it. You shouldn't have to do anything else other than that. Why is this an issue as regards the mosquito board or the vector board? It's this. 30 years of those regulations, you've got more mosquitoes in Coquille Valley, not having anything to do with the Fish and Wildlife Service, than you did 30 years ago.
Yeah, but they're overseeing the permitting
Hold up,
process.
Don.
Yeah, wait a minute, I'm not done. So that's why that is in here. And I'll give you another example, which I can have backed up by Sharon Waterman, who's here right now. I was asked to do a review and possibly get involved in doing a survey of the Toledo drainage, because they want to drain that, or dredge that drainage, and possibly take out the beaver dams that are in there. That is not that hard a process, and well, I mean, it's a difficult process for permitting of something like that. But I've done those sorts of permits. All you do is cross sections of the creek here and there, showing what you're about to take out. But no, ODFW said no. You're going to survey the entire drainage for depth, for plant life, for beaver obstructions, and anything. It's going to cost that drainage, am I right? Tens of thousands of dollars just to do the survey.
The one bid we have is 9,000 some odd
Okay,
dollars.
about $10,000 to do a
About
survey.
$10,000.
That's absolute baloney.
No, that's not quite right.
Why?
I'm on that committee, and that's
Well-
not quite what was said, and sharing that with us.
Yeah, it was a combination of, because of the permitting process, they want, between all the agencies, they want you to have all of this information.
Yeah,
and push.
But the problem is there's some
It's all-
duplicity here, because the
it's all-
ODFW's property is in that drainage, and yet they're going to be an agency that rules on whether or not they're going to give you the permit.
And that's not
That's
what
right.
we do.
It isn't. You don't have any property within that?
We don't regulate whether you dig or not, so that's DSO and planning board.
Oh, yeah, but those permits requests go on to ODFW. I've had them review mine. Not at your level, but up higher.
But we don't regulate whether you dig or not, that's DSO and court.
But everybody, EPA, NOAA, Corps of Engineers.
Well, NIMS and ODFW.
Oh,
They
yes,
don't
but
write
they
opinions
do
about
all
whether
their
it's critical
policies.
habitat or not. It's not how much yardage you're going to take out, but whether or not there's coho there and that sort of thing.
Okay,
Well, anyway, the long and the short of this is this. 30 years of promulgating those sorts of regulations, what's happened? First of all, your ranch and farmlands are not worth as much as they used to be, because your production's been cut. You should be able to just go out there and dredge whenever you have a drainage problem and put that dredge spoil, by the way, in the lowest spot in your pastures. I'm sorry, wetlands are not waters of the state, but that's actually in the law. That's actually in the law. Everyone who owns a plot of land pasture, they took your pasture without a penny in compensation when they wrote that into the law.
We gotta get a permit for every damn tractor.
Right. And so there you have it. And what I'm thinking, you know, if you've got a decent monitoring program and you went back to some decent dredging, you might actually see a lowering in the number of mosquitoes in the county. That's just one of the controversial ways of looking at this. But in terms of the other aspects of it, that is where people are going to do large-scale restoration. And if they start causing mosquito problems, you ought to have, as a citizen of this county, a way to go after them in some compensatory manner. And you can't do it if you don't have it.
Okay. I'll take public comment in a minute. So my sense of what you've written is that it's a good plan that accomplishes a good goal. And if we make it somewhat more apolitical, because unfortunately, we are still, okay, so the political piece doesn't necessarily have to be part of the plan. It can be treated as a separate entity. That the idea of having a monitoring plan in place to know what the mosquito situation is in this particular area, and not necessarily limited to this area, I wouldn't think, right?
Right.
I mean, you know you've got a restoration plan coming up in Coos County. It might be nice to know what the baseline is. But maybe to sell to, I use the term sell loosely, to suggest to the county or some other agency, it may not be the county, that having a mosquito benchmark through a plan like this would be a good idea, is something that we could go forward with. Now, there was some comment that there already is such a thing. That somebody's already done this. Does anyone know about that?
Because last year, the plan the traps they used last year, that was all gone away with. All you have now are your 5 traps that you set up.
So, I guess from the committee's perspective, and Dan, I understand all the other issues you brought up, and there's certainly a lot in there. The question would be, would it make sense for us to basically expand the current 4 or 5 trap system that we have to something like Dan is suggesting, which would be up to 20, although you did point out that you could do it with half that many, or obviously you can always go with more, to whether we want to recommend to the county, because of what's happened in recent past, that this is a good thing to do. So the committee needs to think about whether it's a good thing to do, to establish this baseline. I think.
And I should add that the reason that I put that other stuff in here about countervailing provisions and policies was because it was asked in our last meeting, what would this information be used for? So you're absolutely right. We don't need to put that stuff in any kind of a proposal to establish the monitoring program. But I was just trying to address some of the questions people go, well, so we got the data, what are we going to ever do with it? Yeah, so you're right. That doesn't need to be in it. It's just
part of it needs to be in there. There's no sense in gathering the data if you don't have anything to do with it. But the point is, which I read from what you got, is the useful piece here is if you do this year after year and something happens, you now have a way to determine that that's something, there may be a cause and effect here, right? It's really what you're driving at. And so that if you suddenly, 2 years, 3 years from now, somebody does something and one of these traps suddenly sparks up something, you can now say, whoa, I think I have a cause and effect here. This event caused this effect at this particular location. Because we've been the same for 4 or 5 years, and now suddenly it isn't. Or somebody, well, yeah. So that to me is where the value comes. And I think that's what you put in here, right, Dan?
Yep.
So do you propose, Roger, in this last paragraph, cutting that down to some rationale for the monitoring and then taking up the other more political discussion measures as a separate entity?
Yes.
I mean, let's play the landowner advocate for a second. I mean, Lockman's got water on their property, Carmen's got water on his property. So this goes both ways for restoration people and farmers that go, well, I don't think I have a problem, I don't want to be forced to dig and indirectly be responsible financially. So this is, maybe there's anger towards restoration projects, but there's micro pools an acre to 2 to 5 on all the ranchers and farmers too. So you gotta be careful playing devil's advocate here on who you're going to charge and incur a fine to across the valley floor. I mean, it's easy to see the restoration project is a problem that this abandoned marsh gets fixed, and then they're not a problem, but there's still mosquitoes and they're coming off of Jeff Cochran's. Well, maybe Jeff says, I can't afford the grant. So that seems like that's an issue to discuss in itself at length, rather than add all of that to the monitoring.
No, I wouldn't. I think
Yeah, no, none of that should be in the actual monitoring program. That's going to be a separate proposal that just lays out the equipment we need, how it's going to be done, and how the data will be worked up, and that's it. We don't need anything else.
so.
And then once we start getting numbers, we can start addressing these other issues.
So how does the committee feel as far as whether this is a useful thing for this committee to put forward to develop a monitoring program that would get us a consistent baseline in this particular area of Coos County? Comment from anybody, or is this something we should
I think
look
it'd be
forward?
a good thing. I mean, we've got a new marsh coming on.
I think anytime you can quantify at least the baseline to see a change, regardless of your views of anything, it gives you at least something to go off of.
So what if I suggested to Dan that he redraft this, not much, change it much, take out some of the political stuff that's at the end, because you've had the chance to express that, and I think we know that that probably would go forward, and bring something forward for our next meeting that we could, which is a strict monitoring program, that we would then, the committee could approve, and then I, or somebody else, would take it to the county commissioners and say, this is something we want to do. Here's our plan, here's what it's going to cost, here's the cost benefit of it, and go to the county and say, this is what we want to do.
Do we need to just present it as a monitoring plan, or do we also need to have some ideologies on how it might be paid for?
Well, that's always the case. I mean, we could look at alternative ways to get it paid for. We go out from state funds.
No, I'm just.
Or, even the service, I mean, who knows? So, they may have money in that dredging account that they're not going to use it. It wouldn't take much to get us started. And then the county, I would think, could afford $1,000 a year to keep a monitoring program.
But then it also comes to who's going to count and quantify 20 traps on a regular basis. I mean, it's going to take somebody with expertise,
By the species and.
Well, okay, so
I mean, it's
I can work all that up. Don't do all of that. I'll put it together as an actual proposal.
But at the same time, I think it's something solid. It's a good foundation for this committee. And no disrespect to bat houses, I'm all for it, but this is a more solid step in my
Okay.
opinion.
Can I say something?
sure.
I deal with honeybees and bird insects too, and this year there's been an enormous amount of swarms going on, which means honeybees are really prospering. And last 5-6 years ago, we had some dips in the honeybee population. So you got to remember the weather, the rainfall, those things are going to be thrown in. You just can't say, come 3 years old, mosquitoes coming up. And then in turn, 3 years later, it may not have rain or something that weather affecting it may change, because I see that honeybees, like I mentioned back. You got to take the weather in account and keep monitoring for, you can't do 1 year, like I said. So
And I think, Dan, you
The
understand,
miracles, yeah.
Dan, you understand how that comes into this whole picture is annual rainfall and all those other things have an impact on it.
Monitoring, more data is a great thing.
Okay, so let me propose that the committee, I'm sorry. Sure.
If we were going to do this, I don't know what the reasoning was, why we stopped at Johnsonville Pond almost.
Dan?
And the Napa,
I was just looking
at the lower valley, the Napa part of the river goes all the way to Little Point,
no, I know.
and up north of Fort. And I would think that it would be wise to do it all, not to stop.
Just in the title.
Yeah, right.
Well,
We just have to look at, if I were to shoot for this, I'd try to get 40 traps. For the reason that you would want extras just in case something gets broken, but also have, if once you establish the protocol, we can go to any place in the county to do this.